From FingerLakes1.com, I'm Josh Durso, and this is Inside the FLX. Our program today begins when former Seneca County Judge Dennis Bender announced that he would be leaving his post in 2018. Out of that news and subsequent retirement, 3 candidates appeared and will go before voters in Thursday's Republican primary. District Attorney Barry Porsche, former District Attorney Donna Cathy, and local Attorney David Ettman will all be on the ballot. Ettman is our guest this hour as all 3 candidates visit the program ahead of that primary contest. David, thanks a lot for being here.
Thank you. Good morning, Josh.
So let's get the easy one right out of the way right off the bat. Why are you running for county judge, and what's inspired you to take that leap?
Okay, well, let me start off with the first thing. You said the Republican primary on the 13th. There is a party primary across the board on Thursday. Republicans, because all 3 of us are registered Republicans, but because it's a judicial election, each of us were allowed to pass petitions for other parties. Mr. Porsche will be on all lines. He was able to find people that would sign petitions for him on the smaller parties. I'm on 6 lines, and Ms. Cathy is on 4 lines. So not only is it the Republicans, but it's also the Conservatives, the Democrats, the Greens, the Independence Party, the Working Families Party, and the Reform Party. So there will be, as I said, any registered party or any registered voter who's an enrolled member of a party will have a primary on Thursday.
So what is that? Why are you running for judge? What is that that's driving you or drove you to make that choice?
I think the simplest answer is I've been practicing in the Seneca County courts for 26 years now. And I say the Seneca County courts. I have been in the justice courts, the misdemeanor, the town justice courts, the village courts. When I started, after I left the depot as the JAG in '92, you start up. I had criminal experience, so I did county court work for criminal work. I did divorces. I did Supreme Court area work. I did land use issues with both boards and in court. And so you work your way up the line. And after being in private practice, representing clients actively in all of those courts, and not only Seneca courts, but also in other counties, when Judge Bender announced his retirement, which was frankly pretty unexpected, you take a step back, you look around and see, okay, what are the options going to be? And it's very simple. I'm the only candidate running that has all of the experience in all of the courts that the county judge is responsible for. And it's something that I don't think I ever really planned on it, but it's a case when you look and see, this is what I need to do. I think I have good ideas on how to manage the court, run the court. I also have good ideas on how to approach a lot of the issues that we have. And that's something that the county judge can do in a variety of different ways.
And what do you think those issues are? What do you think the main issues are that are really driving this race in particular?
We'll start off with, frankly, Mr. Porsche and Ms. Cathy, their legal background is prosecution. I think Ms. Cathy's bio and much of her announcements always talks about wanting to be an attorney at an early age, wanting to be a prosecutor, and pretty much all of her training was oriented that way. She served as the county district attorney for about 8 years. I was one of her assistants back then. So that's part of it, and then other issues. I think that the fact that Mr. Porsche's trial experience is limited to just prosecution work brings it a little bit into question, is how can they properly handle all of the responsibilities that go with being a judge outside of the county court criminal area, which is only really about 15 to 20% of the caseload. It's the sexy part, it gets all the headlines, but that's not what the judge does most of the time. Mm-hmm. Both of them, I think, as prosecutors, indicted into felony cases, indicted into county court, maybe 100 to 125 cases a year. That's a good week in family court.
Right. I
mean, you see, and not every case that's filed in family court goes in front of the family court judge, but that's 60 to 70% of the judge's caseload. And I'm the only one that has the real experience in there, not only representing individuals or children, but also being effectively a prosecutor in family court, as for child abuse cases, neglect cases, juvenile delinquency, PINs, handling adoptions. I mean, you do that over a course of time, and I've been fortunate also, now that I'm the assistant county attorney, to go back to something that I did 15 years ago, which is representing the department and trying to protect the innocent children and similarly vulnerable adults in the community.
Is the vastness of the role of judge the most underappreciated, or one of the most underappreciated aspects of this process?
I think so. When I've met a lot of people, we jokingly say, for most folks, this is the only time they're going to get to see their county court judge is when they're out running for office. People hear the name, and unless you see them in the community, most people in Seneca County don't go to court. And the fact that they don't, and the only real publicity that comes out of the court is from the criminal side, the county court, and to a lesser degree, the high-profile cases such as the landfill issues or the incinerator issues or some of the land use development. That's the only thing people see, and that doesn't balance out in the public perception. The judge is responsible for so many things on a daily basis that it's very difficult to see that in the real world for people looking in.
So I want you to talk a little more about the experience side of it. You seem to have the most diverse experience, I guess, at least from the casual observer on the outside. What about that experience you think lends itself best to you being the next judge?
I can give you the simple and funny answer. Most people are familiar with the Farmers Insurance commercials that run on TV. Maybe it's a takeoff on the T-shirt. Been there, done that, and got the T-shirt. It's important to have experience in an area so that the first time a case comes up, it's not just the first time you've seen it. Having that background, it's the fact that I have been both a prosecutor and a defense counsel in vehicular homicide cases, that I've been I've been a defense counsel in a capital murder trial, which is something that hopefully will never come to pass in Seneca County, because when that comes up, you're talking about a pretty heinous crime. And I don't want that to be on any person in Seneca County. But it gives you that perspective, which I think I've gained over my career. A lot of what I've done, I've always called it consumer law. I did a lot of bankruptcy work. People don't like to file bankruptcy. People don't want to file bankruptcy. But sometimes they're caught in a position. And it's been advantageous for me to talk to them and say, okay, this is the process. Whether your creditors are calling, whether people are going to go, we're going to go through this. Something like this is going to happen. The same way applies in family court, in a custody case, representing, both mothers, fathers, grandparents, aunts, and uncles in custody, and sometimes representing children as the attorney for the child. You have the experience to walk them through the process. And what that gives you is an expectation as a judge. The judge should have a good idea of what to expect in that courtroom. Do you know what the prosecutor is thinking? Not always. Do you know what the defense counsel is thinking? Not always, but you can see a pattern developing or how they're progressing with their case. Chess players, bridge players. You gain that experience to see what's happening so that you know how to respond. And that's something that a lot of the experience, and the trial experience, makes it so critical.
Now, let's talk a little bit about the community building aspect of it, because it seems like a lot of what you're talking about, a lot of the interaction that you have, whether it's with clients or whether it's with other attorneys in the process, prosecutors, etc., it seems like there has to be a little bit of community building that goes into the different parts that make a good judge. Is that the case, and what do you think some of those efforts need to look like to sort of educate people so they know and understand what the judgeship is all about?
Part of my experience, and I touch on this, as being in the military courts martial system. As an Army JAG officer, as both a prosecutor and a defense counsel, the first rule is what we call open discovery, open books. The defense is entitled to know pretty much everything that the prosecutor has. And from a defense counsel's perspective, you want to know because your client doesn't want to admit their guilt most of the time. They don't want to sit there and say, yes, I did this, and particularly the more heinous. But what you do want to be able to tell them is, look, this is the evidence. The prosecutor has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. and with legal and competent evidence. Well, here is the legal and competent evidence. This is what they're going to prove in court. So now we need to either have some really good answers here and some really good evidence to refute that, or we really need to seriously consider your options. We don't need to waste a lot of time on trials, and we don't need to waste a lot of time in the pretrial phase because we're playing hide the ball. I see that in some counties locally where they have clear open discovery, the process goes well, there's generally good communication, and criminal justice proceeds. We have other counties where you're lucky if you get 5 pages of discovery material, when eventually the court will probably turn around and order the disclosure of 500 pages because somebody's concerned that, it's not going to be right. It's about justice and fairness and due process. The same thing applies to agree and family court. One of the things that I've had the experience of, not only in Seneca County but in other counties, is that family court unfortunately takes up a lot of time. And a lot of court appearances, you wait for 45 minutes, you wait for an hour, and you're in the court in front of the judge for 5 or 10 minutes, and you move on to something else. Since I've been, as part of my practice in general, but since I've been the assistant county attorney handling with the family court work, one of the things I've tried to do is encourage as much communication between our people, our department, our caseworkers, and the parties' attorneys, so that they know this is where we are, this is our position. Talk to your clients ahead of time. Let's see if we can move along here. Because justice delayed is justice denied, not only in criminal proceedings but also in family and civil matters. And I think having the perspective of being in private practice, I know lawyers can't be 3 places at once. We understand that. But for a judge who hasn't been in private practice, it takes them a while to understand that. There are some good examples, and there are also some very bad examples of that. But what it comes down to is having that experience to build the consensus, to communicate, because that's really what it's all about, is the communication between the attorneys to make sure that the information is there, and that the communication occurs between their attorneys and their clients and the other people that are involved in the process. And that's one of the most important things that I think I can develop and work with, because I've been doing it.
Now, as we've talked to listeners and readers, I'm glad you talked about the different aspects of that, because the fairness part seems to be one of the big concerns. We've heard from a lot of folks who have said, you have 2 prosecutors, former and current, and then you have a defense attorney. This combination working towards, will there be any sort of bias, or could there be bias when whoever that may be, that next person takes on the judgeship?
I'm not sure you mean bias towards
one side or another, yeah. just because of what the natural experience line is.
Fortunately, I've done both things, and I've done both things in very serious cases. It's not a matter of always just traffic tickets that I prosecuted. No, I've done serious prosecution work, drug cases, assault, child abuse cases, some of it in the military, some of it while I was assistant district attorney. But what I've said both to law enforcement repeatedly, because I've ended up representing a lot of law enforcement personnel in civil matters, private matters over time, and I've gone back and spoken to people like former Under Sheriff LaWatch and a couple others. I always say, and also I say in family court, because I represented the Department of Social Services for now, and that was one of the concerns. Are you really going to be on our side? One of the things I like to say is, from the day I became a lawyer, I have zealously represented my client's interest. As a defense counsel, as a counsel for an individual client, I've tried to zealously represent my client's interest. As a prosecutor, I zealously represent the prosecution of the case, the people of the state of New York, or the people of the United States. As a judge, your client is the law. Your client is the process. We're taught to respect the law, and that's the foundation of our government, our justice system. But at the same time, the law, the institutions have to respect the people. And if it's not fair, if people don't understand what's happening, then they lose faith in the system. So when somebody asks the fact that and I admit I've been primarily a defense counsel, but that doesn't stand in the way of me knowing what's fair and right. I know the law. I've sat as a judge. maybe I ask a few more questions. I'm not necessarily going to rubber stamp things, but I think my obligation as a judge is to look beyond the face. Mm-hmm. But I made a ruling, I make rulings, and that's the issue. I've acted as a judge on search warrants. I've acted as a judge on bench warrants, applications for arrest warrants. As long as the information is there that's required by the law, that's not an issue, because I represent the law at that point when I'm wearing my judge hat. And I look forward to that, being able to do that for the rest of my career.
Now, do you think the complexity of law in general sort of lends itself to people being a little bit glazed over when it comes to these judge races? Because they are really complex stuff, and the issues aren't always, out in front like a traditional political race.
Excuse me. If you mean that a candidate for a candidate for assembly or a candidate for representative, they can sit there and say, this is what I want to do. I want to lower your taxes, raise your taxes, increase your services, tear up your roads and build new ones. Okay, fine. That's their responsibility. A judge's responsibility, and particularly at this level, is we're not legislators. People ask me questions, and it is important locally. How do you feel about the Second Amendment? I say, I took an oath to defend the Constitution of the United States from all enemies, foreign and domestic, when I became a commissioned officer. The Second Amendment says what it says. The courts, more importantly, above me, have ruled on what the various statutes and laws that we have, both state and local, and federal. So being able to stay within the bounds of the law, that's what I'm obligated to do. My obligation as a trial court judge is to deal with the facts before me and apply the law. So is that difficult for some people to understand? It could be, but it's actually very simple. I can't raise your taxes. I can't lower your taxes. I can't make burdensome regulations disappear. Mm-hmm. But put it in the context of a dispute in court, I take the law, I look at the precedent, I look at the facts of each case, and I make a ruling based on that. And so that's the simple part. Mm-hmm. And what people have to understand is the hard part is putting yourself or putting whoever you put in office as the judge, having the knowledge and the experience to be able to do that fairly and appropriately in all cases.
Now, you mentioned the Second Amendment, and of course, given the divisive political times we live in now, things like that are always going to come up from voters. But I'm curious, what are a couple of the most compelling stories or concerns or even just kudos that you've received throughout the process? As you still have to talk to people. Right. You still have to engage with people. What are some of the things you've heard that have really made you say, yeah, this is why I'm doing it?
I have to be honest. When I started the campaign, and the first 3 or 4 people I talked to all wanted to talk about pistol permits. And when I say honestly, I was in the military on active in the reserves initially for 3.5, going on 4 years. Served on active duty for about 8.5 years, then finished up time in the reserves. In high school, I didn't grow up in a hunting tradition. I went to Boy Scout camp and found out I was a pretty good shot, mm-hmm. And turned around that my high school had a rifle team. We did very well, and I was good at it. And I did the same thing when I did ROTC in college. You get in the military, you qualify, you do your part, and unless you're in infantry or direct combat arms, you don't really fire, do your weapons, but I did my part. And so when I got out of the military, I had 2 children at that point. Your time is taken up. Not having been a hunter, I'd kind of lost contact with competitive shooting sports, and I did other things. I joked when I first started, I don't own a handgun, but then I don't own any weapons at this point. But I also don't own any golf clubs either. I just had time was spent in doing other things. Mm-hmm. But I found out very quickly that pistol permits were a very big issue in the county. I spent some time educating myself. I went to see a couple of the gun dealers locally, spoke with a lot of people at the sportsmen's clubs in the community to get a better feel for what their issues were. And what I ultimately found out is their biggest concern is that law-abiding citizens that pass the background check did not receive full concealed carry permits, that there were some restrictions or things. And I spent a lot of time looking at that, and I haven't spoken with Judge Bender about that because he was the judge that handled it for the last 24 years. I've spoken to a couple other judges in some other counties. And so my biggest concern really came back to one of the first things I learned in the Army Reserve, is that it's safety. I think, as a general rule, that people that have experience with firearms, corrections officers, law enforcement, hunters, longtime hunters, and whatever, the biggest concern I have is that they have an understanding of how dangerous firearms are, that they're used to handling them, they're used to securing them. And so that's where my concerns are, is in the safety aspect of it. People that have that kind of background, I don't have very many concerns with that. It's people that don't have any of those backgrounds that all of a sudden are deciding to apply for a pistol permit that I may have some questions. But it's not any type of blanket policy or concern. That's something that I can't do as a judge. But as we discussed at the recent meeting of Scope, and I've done on the road with people and talking, and I even have one of my ads that talks about it. It's an individual. You make your application, you pass your background check, and as long as you meet the basic requirements and that you have that familiarity, then I don't have any problems.
So what are obviously lengthy tenure for Judge Bender. What are some of the things that you want to build on, or you hope to build on if given the opportunity to be judge?
As a working rule among attorneys, Judge Bender had a good reputation as not being an authoritarian, of not being demeaning to people in the courtroom, that he understood his role, he understood the roles of the attorneys. It wasn't to say that he couldn't I'll use judicially lose his temper, but he had generally a good reputation. People didn't mind coming to practice in front of Judge Bender. There are some judges that people had, it was tough. You didn't know what to expect on certain days. And generally, Judge Bender was fairly consistent. And I think it was part of his background. He had been a DSS attorney, he'd had a private practice, and then he was a district attorney for several years, tried some very major cases, and then became the judge, and learned over his tenure. I want to build on that. I think that the courtroom needs to be professional. There needs to be respect shown for everyone. I think that communication that I talked about was very important. I think that building on that communication among the town justices with the Magistrates and Court Clerks Association is important. I think you can have conversations with attorneys that are involved in the system without talking about specific cases that can help you and try and maintain that professional and collegial balance in the court system. It's always adversarial, but for the attorneys. But the court should be in a position to make the system work and try and build on that. And that's what I'd like to do.
So where can, last question for you, where can folks connect with you, learn more about what you're trying to do, why you're running, whether that's social media, websites? I'm sure you've got them all covered.
From day one, I put my phone number out there. It's my old office phone number, rings through to my cell phone, 315-568-8199. I don't get as many calls as I would like. I have my website, davidettman.com. We were very creative with that. We have the Facebook page. I'm usually up in the morning going through, and we try and do replies, etc., during the day when I have the time. But people call, and that's the davidettman.com. There's our videos that we've run where I've talked about the issues, where other people have talked about me. And those are the best ways to find it. But really, my phone number and the website are the best ways to check it out.
All right. Well, I really appreciate the time, and best of luck next week.
Thank you, Josh. I appreciate it. Have a good day.
Well, that's going to do it for us today. I'd like to thank David, our listeners, and of course, FingerLakes1.com for making this program possible. Keep listening, and until next time, stay tuned to FingerLakes1.com for the latest news, weather, sports, and more.